lying under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital. I could hear the faint buzz above me, a sound that made the room feel even more sterile and cold. My body ached from exhaustion, and the doctor's words still echoed in my mind, stress-induced complications. At 63, I had told myself I was strong, that I could handle anything, but my body had betrayed me. What I didn't realize until that night was that the deepest wound wasn't physical at all. As I waited for the nurse to return, my phone lit up with a notification. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe it was my son, checking in on me, worried about his mother. But when I opened the screen, my heart clenched so tightly I thought it might stop again. It was a family photo. My son Michael sat smiling at the head of the dining table, the very table my late husband and I had once saved for, piece by piece. His wife, Lauren, looked radiant in the chair I used to occupy, laughter spilling out of her as if she were the queen of that house. And there was Emma, my 12-year-old granddaughter, caught mid-laugh, her face glowing with the kind of joy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. The caption underneath cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. Finally, a day without the drama queen. Dinner feels so much more peaceful. My hands trembled as I stared at that glowing screen. They weren't just living their lives while I lay alone in a hospital bed. They were celebrating my absence, relieved that I wasn't there. It wasn't just a careless post. It was the truth they had been carrying all along, hidden behind polite smiles and shallow gestures. I felt the room spin around me as reality set in. My son had been called by the doctors, and yet he chose dinner instead. My daughter-in-law used my illness as the punchline to a joke, and my sweet Emma, she was smiling in the picture, not knowing that her grandmother was lying alone under the same cold lights where I now sat. That night, with my phone still burning in my palm, I realized something I had been denying for far too long. I wasn't part of their family anymore. I had become invisible, erased from the story I once built with my own hands. And that was the moment everything began to change. When my husband, Daniel, passed away, the silence in our home was unbearable. After 40 years together, the house that once rang with laughter and shared routines suddenly felt like an empty shell. Every corner carried echoes of him, the smell of his cologne lingering in the closet, the faint scratch marks on the kitchen table where he always insisted on sitting, even when the wood had long worn down. I was 60 at the time, freshly widowed, and I thought the hardest challenge would be learning how to live without him. I never imagined that grief would leave me so vulnerable to something much darker. In those early weeks, my son Michael was attentive. He would stop by often, bringing groceries or sitting with me on the porch. Sometimes his wife Lauren came too, carrying Emma on her hip, her voice soft with sympathy. I clung to those visits, believing they came from love. When Michael gently suggested that it wasn't healthy for me to rattle around in that big 4-bedroom house by myself, I believed he was right. And when Lauren added that it might bring me comfort to have family around, I let myself be persuaded. At first, it felt like the right choice. They moved in under the guise of helping me manage the property. Emma filled the halls with her laughter again, and I told myself that maybe this was what Daniel would have wanted to see: the family close, the home alive again. I downsized to a small apartment, telling everyone it was temporary. That word, temporary, was what made me feel safe. But weeks turned into months, and months into years. Somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. My home no longer looked like mine. The wallpaper Daniel and I picked together was painted over. My belongings disappeared into storage. The cozy den where we once spent winters by the fire was turned into a sleek office space for Lauren's work. Every time I visited, I felt like an intruder, as though I had to knock before entering what had once been my own living room. Meanwhile, my apartment grew smaller in spirit, even if its square footage stayed the same. The walls felt closer each night, the silence heavier. My life reduced itself to simple routines, heating leftovers, folding laundry, looking through old photo albums. Sometimes I caught myself apologizing to the empty room for taking up space. What hurt most wasn't the loss of a house. It was the slow erosion of my place in their lives. Family dinners went on without me. Vacations were planned without a thought of including me. And each time I convinced myself to speak up, there was a new excuse. Finances, stress, timing. I told myself to be patient, to be understanding. But patience only made me invisible. Looking back, I see how naive I was. Grief had softened my defenses, and I mistook manipulation for care. By the time I realized the truth, I was already living like a guest in my own family story. And that was the thought burning in me as I left the hospital. For the first time in years, I knew something had to change. When the nurse handed me the discharge papers that morning, she asked if my son was coming to pick me up. I forced a polite smile and said I'd be calling a cab. Deep down, I knew the truth: he wasn't coming. He had already chosen his dinner table over his mother's hospital bed. That realization, painful as it was, did something unexpected inside me. For the first time in years, my voice felt steady. My hands no longer trembled. I wasn't going to sit around waiting to be rescued by people who had already abandoned me. On the ride home, staring out of the taxi window, a decision formed in my mind. I picked up my phone and dialed Barbara, an old real estate agent I hadn't spoken to in years. She had once told me, half jokingly, that my house could sell in less than a week if I ever decided to move. I had laughed it off then. Now, the thought of reclaiming it, even if only to sell, felt like a lifeline. "Barbara," I told her, "I'm ready." That single call was the first brick I laid on the road back to myself. When we met the next morning, Barbara brought along a lawyer friend to go over my situation. As they laid papers across my small kitchen table, the layers of betrayal began to reveal themselves. At first, it was small things, utility bills that had been routed without my knowledge, property taxes filed late then suddenly handled, bank statements I had never seen. They had been redirecting my mail for years, quietly building a wall between me and my own affairs. Each discovery was like a slow tightening around my chest. I told myself to stay calm, but when the lawyer looked me in the eye and asked the last time I had checked my credit report, I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't. Not in years. Why would I? I trusted my son. The silence in the room grew heavier as the lawyer made a few calls and logged into monitoring services. Then she slid the papers toward me. I will never forget what I saw. A home equity loan, $75,000, taken out in my name 6 months earlier. The room seemed to spin. I gripped the edge of the table, my mind racing. I had never signed those documents. I had never seen them. Yet here they were, legal, processed, tied to my identity. My own house, the one Daniel and I had spent decades paying off. had been used as collateral for debts I never knew existed. It wasn't just neglect or thoughtlessness anymore. This was calculated, cold, criminal. I felt the heat rise in me, a burning anger that had been smothered for too long. All those times they smiled at me, called me dramatic, reassured me that everything was under control. It had been lies. They hadn't just taken over my home. They had taken over my life. For the first time since Daniel died, I felt something other than grief or loneliness. I felt rage, and underneath it, a steel, hard resolve. If they thought I was going to roll over and keep letting them write me out of my own story, they were wrong. Dead wrong. And as I stared at those fraudulent papers, I realized that what I'd uncovered so far was likely only the beginning. The more Barbara and Patricia, my real estate agent and lawyer, dug, the more it felt like my life had been hollowed out while I wasn't looking. What started with one fraudulent loan unraveled into something much larger, a carefully woven web designed to keep me in the dark. At first, we combed through property records and bank statements. I expected a few irregularities, maybe another bill or two I hadn't seen. But what they laid in front of me was staggering. There were credit card accounts I had never opened, each showing charges for restaurants I'd never been to, clothing I'd never worn, vacations I hadn't even known about. Thousands of dollars, all linked back to my name, my address, my identity. Every page felt like another knife to the heart. I kept asking myself, how could I have been so blind? I remembered telling myself, after Daniel's passing, that I was lucky to have family close, that Michael and Lauren were doing their best to look after me. Yet here was proof they hadn't just been managing my life, they had been siphoning it, piece by piece, for their own gain. Barbara leaned over the paperwork, tapping at the records with her pen. "This isn't just negligence," she said. "This is systematic." And I knew she was right. But the betrayal wasn't only in numbers and balances. One night, I sat down with my phone and scrolled through years of social media posts I had never paid much attention to. And what I saw there broke me in ways the paperwork hadn't. Birthday parties I was never invited to. Holiday dinners where my chair sat empty. Vacations where my son posed with his wife and daughter, smiling as if I didn't exist. The captions were all carefully worded little explanations about how I wasn't much of a social person anymore, or how I needed time alone, as though I had chosen isolation. Friends and relatives commented with sympathy, unaware of the truth. And underneath it all, I saw Lauren's words again and again, painting me as dramatic, difficult, unstable. It wasn't just financial theft, it was character theft. They weren't only taking my money, they were rewriting who I was in the eyes of everyone else. Then came the moment that broke me most of all. Scrolling further back, I found photos from last Christmas. I had spent it alone, telling myself maybe Michael's family wanted a quieter holiday. But the pictures told another story. They had been in Mexico, drinking margaritas by a pool, celebrating with friends. My granddaughter Emma wasn't in a single picture. My heart raced as I pieced it together. Where had she been a few days later? The answer came out in a conversation that still haunts me. She had been left with a friend's family for a week while her parents claimed they were visiting sick relatives. She hadn't even known the truth that they had abandoned her to chase sunshine and luxury, using money stolen in my name. That realization cut deeper than anything else. Because I could live with my own pain. I could carry betrayal and loss on my shoulders. But seeing how easily they had discarded their own child, using her as a prop when it suited them and leaving her behind when it didn't, that was when I knew this wasn't just selfishness. It was predation. These weren't small missteps or desperate mistakes. They had planned this. They had manipulated me, isolated me, drained my accounts, and even rewritten the story of who I was to the outside world. And now, as I sat surrounded by evidence of their deception, one truth became terrifyingly clear. They weren't finished. Every page of those statements, every missing holiday, every staged photo, it all pointed to something much bigger than financial greed. They weren't simply enjoying a free ride. They were preparing for something. A long game I had only begun to glimpse, and I could feel it, like a storm rolling on the horizon. Something worse was coming. Just when I thought I had uncovered the worst of it, the loans, the credit cards, the vacations bought with my name, Patricia, my lawyer, laid the final piece of the puzzle on the table. She had been tracking inquiries made under my Social Security number, and what she found made my blood run cold. Multiple consultations with elder law attorneys, notes about assessments, documents drafted but never filed, all pointing toward one terrifying conclusion: Michael and Lauren were preparing a guardianship petition. They wanted me declared legally incompetent. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. It was as if the air itself had been stolen, just like everything else they had taken from me. My own son had been plotting to strip me not just of my money, not just of my home, but of my very autonomy. If they had succeeded, I would have become a prisoner in my own skin, every decision controlled, every choice erased. The anger that rose in me then was unlike anything I had ever known. But alongside it came something else: clarity. For 3 years, I had been shrinking, apologizing, bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes to fit into the space they left for me. No more. If they thought they could silence me, erase me, and rewrite the ending to my story, they had underestimated the strength of a woman who had already buried a husband and rebuilt herself once before. I remember whispering to myself that night, I will not be their victim. The very next morning, the betrayal took on a new face. A small knock at my door, and there stood Emma, suitcase in hand, eyes red from crying. My granddaughter, barely 12, had been sent to plead with me. She said her parents told her they might lose their home because I was being selfish. They had used her as a shield, a bargaining chip in their twisted game. Seeing her like that broke my heart, but it also lit a fire in me. I pulled her into my arms and promised her that she would never be homeless, never be without love, not while I still had breath in my body. I told her, softly but firmly, that she wasn't the one who needed to carry these burdens. It was me, and I was done being silent. That night, as she slept on my couch, I sat at the kitchen table with Patricia's folder spread open before me. Each document, each forged signature, each inquiry into my supposed incompetence became fuel. They thought they had written the final act of my story. Instead, they had written themselves into the role of villains, and I was ready to fight them with everything I had, not just for me, but for Emma. Because protecting her meant protecting the truth, and for the first time in years, I felt strong enough to do both. The day I walked into the courthouse, I felt the weight of every sleepless night, every tear I had shed, every moment I had doubted myself. Yet beneath that heaviness, there was a strength I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Emma, and it was about reclaiming the truth that had been twisted for so long. The courtroom was cold, lined with stiff benches and the quiet hum of whispers. Across from me sat Michael and Lauren, their faces pale and tight with defiance. For a fleeting moment, I almost searched for the boy I had raised, the child who used to slip his small hand into mine on the way to school. But that boy was gone. In his place sat a man who had chosen greed over love, lies over family. Patricia presented the evidence with a precision that left no room for doubt. Bank records, forged signatures, fraudulent accounts, all tied directly to their hands. Each document laid bare the trail of theft they had tried to bury. I watched as the judge's expression hardened, as even the jury seemed to flinch at the sheer audacity of what they had done. And then came the testimony about Emma. The vacations she was excluded from. The nights she was left with strangers while her parents lived lavishly on stolen money. When I heard her small voice on the witness stand, steady but trembling, describing how she felt invisible in her own family, my heart shattered all over again. But I also felt pride in her courage. Pride that she refused to be silenced, even at 12. When the ruling finally came, it was as if the air shifted. The court recognized the fraud, the identity theft, the betrayal. Michael and Lauren were ordered to face criminal charges, and most importantly, custody of Emma was granted to me. She would no longer be a pawn in their games. She would have stability, love, and safety. I should have felt only triumph in that moment. And in many ways, I did. But there was also grief woven into the victory, because as much as I had fought to protect myself and Emma, I had also lost something I could never get back: the son I thought I knew. Still, as I held Emma's hand and we walked out of that courthouse together, I knew we had both won something far more valuable than any house or bank account. We had won back our dignity, our freedom, our chance to write a new story together. And for the first time in years, I felt the chains of betrayal begin to fall away. Life looks different now. The house where so much of this pain unfolded is no longer mine, and strangely, that feels like freedom. These days, I live in a smaller home, one that feels warm not because of its size, but because of the love inside it. Emma has her own room here, decorated with posters and books she picked out herself, and her laughter fills the halls in a way that makes every struggle worth it. There are moments, of course, when I catch myself wondering how I could have let things go on for so long, how I silenced my own instincts, convincing myself that patience and understanding would somehow be enough. I regret those lost years, the birthdays missed, the holidays spent alone. But what I do not regret, not for a single second, is fighting back, choosing dignity over silence, choosing truth over convenience, choosing to protect Emma and myself, even when it meant losing my son. I have learned that family is supposed to be a place of safety, not exploitation. Real love doesn't drain you, doesn't rewrite your story to make you smaller. Real love lifts you, protects you, and stands beside you in your weakest hour. And sometimes, when those who should protect us instead become the ones who harm us, the bravest thing we can do is draw a line and say no more. Now, each evening, Emma and I sit together at our table, and share simple meals, small victories, and quiet joys. It isn't the life I imagined all those years ago, but in many ways, it is richer, because it is honest. If you've ever faced betrayal or felt erased in your own family story, I want you to know this: your voice matters. Your dignity matters. Don't be afraid to fight for it. Thank you for listening to mine. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd love to hear your story, too.